At this moment, somewhere in the archives of a research institution that advises multiple central banks, there is a draft working paper that has not been published and may never be. Its title is Neutral: Historical Evolution of Public Debt Thresholds and Policy Analysis. The substance is less neutral. The paper documents how the debt to GDP ratios that institutions cite as danger zones have shifted steadily upward over the past 4 decades, not because the underlying economics changed, but because actual debt levels kept rising and the frameworks had to adjust to avoid declaring most advanced economies insolvent. The first threshold that gained wide acceptance was 60%, anchored in the Maastricht Treaty criteria for Eurozone membership in the early 1990s. By the mid-2000s, research suggested that 90% was the point where growth began to suffer. After the global financial crisis, when many countries crossed 90% without immediate collapse, new models emerged showing that thresholds varied by country and could be as high as 130% or more under certain conditions. The pattern, according to the draft paper, is clear. The thresholds follow the debt, not the other way around. The question the paper raises is straightforward but uncomfortable. Are these thresholds genuine discoveries about economic stability, or are they post hoc rationalizations designed to accommodate the fiscal choices that governments have already made? If the thresholds were based on stable economic relationships, they would not need constant upward revision. They would be fixed, like physical constants. Instead, they behave more like moving targets. When debt was low, the threshold was low. As debt rose, the threshold rose with it. The institutions that produce these estimates do not acknowledge this pattern openly. They frame each revision as a methodological improvement, a better understanding of the data, or a recognition of country-specific factors. But to an outside observer, it looks like a system that is reverse engineering the limits to fit the reality, rather than using limits to constrain behavior. The most influential research on debt thresholds came from a study published in 2010 by economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. The study analyzed decades of data from dozens of countries and concluded that when public debt exceeded 90% of GDP, average growth rates fell sharply. The finding was widely cited by policymakers advocating for fiscal consolidation. It was used to justify austerity measures in Europe and spending cuts in the United States. The 90% threshold became a focal point in policy debates. It was treated not as a statistical correlation, but as a hard rule. Cross that line, the argument went, and economic performance would deteriorate. The implication was that countries should do whatever was necessary to stay below the threshold, even if that meant cutting spending during a downturn. 3 years later, the Reinhart-Rogoff finding was challenged. Researchers discovered errors in the original spreadsheet and questioned the statistical methods used to derive the threshold. When the analysis was corrected and extended, the sharp drop in growth at 90% disappeared. The relationship between debt and growth was weaker and less consistent than the original paper suggested. In some countries, high debt was associated with slower growth. In others, it was not. There was no universal tipping point. The 90% threshold, it turned out, was not a law of economics. It was an artifact of selective data and methodological choices. The correction received attention in academic circles and some media coverage, but by then the threshold had already been embedded in policy frameworks. It continued to be cited long after its empirical foundation had been undermined. The controversy over the 90% threshold revealed something important about how these benchmarks function. They are not neutral scientific findings. They are constructed through choices about data samples, time periods, control variables, and functional forms. Different choices produce different thresholds. A study using data from 1960 to 2009 might find a threshold at 50%. A study using data from 1990 to 2015 might find one at 130%. Both can be technically correct within their specified frameworks, but they lead to opposite policy conclusions. The fact that thresholds are sensitive to these methodological decisions means that they can be shaped intentionally or not to support particular policy agendas. Institutions that favor fiscal discipline tend to produce lower thresholds. Institutions that prioritize growth and public investment tend to produce higher ones. The official debt sustainability frameworks used by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank do not rely on a single universal threshold. Instead, they use country-specific benchmarks that depend on institutional quality, economic structure, and historical performance. For low-income countries, the thresholds are lower, typically in the range of 30 to 55% of GDP for external debt. For advanced economies, the thresholds are higher, often implicitly set around 80 to 100%, though the frameworks do not state this explicitly. The rationale is that countries with stronger institutions, deeper financial markets, and better track records can sustain higher debt levels without triggering crises. This approach sounds reasonable, but it introduces flexibility that can be exploited. If a country's debt rises, the framework can be adjusted by upgrading the assessment of institutional capacity, thereby raising the threshold and avoiding a negative judgment. The evolution of these frameworks can be traced through successive revisions. The original debt sustainability framework for low-income countries, introduced in 2005, used fixed thresholds based on export earnings and fiscal revenue. A country with debt above those thresholds was classified as being at high risk of distress. By 2017, the framework had been revised to incorporate a composite indicator of debt-carrying capacity that included factors such as growth performance, reserve adequacy, and remittance flows. This change allowed for higher thresholds in countries that scored well on the composite measure. In practice, it meant that more countries could sustain higher debt without being flagged as high risk. The stated reason for the revision was to better capture the heterogeneity across countries. The unstated effect was to reduce the number of countries classified as being in or near debt distress at a time when many were accumulating debt rapidly. A similar pattern appears in the treatment of advanced economies. Before the financial crisis, the informal consensus was that advanced economy debt above 60% of GDP was elevated and should be reduced. After the crisis, when most advanced economies crossed 80 or even 100%, the language shifted. Debt was described as high but manageable, provided that interest rates stayed low and growth recovered. The threshold did not formally change because there was no formal threshold for advanced economies in the first place. But the tolerance zone expanded. Policy discussions that once treated 60% as a warning sign began treating 100% as the new normal. This shift was justified by pointing to historically low interest rates, which reduced debt service costs, and by emphasizing the need for counter-cyclical fiscal policy during downturns. Both arguments had merit, but they also conveniently aligned with the political reality that no major economy was willing or able to undertake the fiscal adjustment required to bring debt back below 60%. The question of causality complicates the interpretation of debt thresholds. Does high debt cause low growth, or does low growth cause high debt? Most empirical studies find correlations, but correlations do not establish direction. A country in recession will see its debt ratio rise mechanically as GDP falls and automatic stabilizers kick in. At the same time, high debt may constrain fiscal space and force austerity that dampens growth. The two effects can reinforce each other, creating a feedback loop that is difficult to disentangle statistically. Some studies attempt to address this by using instrumental variables or by focusing on episodes where debt increased for reasons unrelated to growth, such as wars or banking crises. These studies generally find that debt has a modest negative effect on growth, but the effect is not large and does not appear suddenly at a specific threshold. It accumulates gradually as debt rises. The draft paper also examines who benefits from the existence of thresholds, regardless of their empirical validity. For fiscal conservatives, low thresholds provide a quantitative anchor for arguments in favor of spending cuts and deficit reduction. For governments seeking to borrow, high thresholds or flexible frameworks provide justification for continued issuance. For international financial institutions, thresholds serve as diagnostic tools that trigger program conditions and resource allocation decisions. Each group has an interest in the level and rigidity of the threshold. This does not mean the thresholds are cynically constructed, but it does mean they are not produced in a vacuum. They emerge from institutions that operate within political and economic constraints, and those constraints shape the analysis. One section of the paper focuses on the upward drift in what is considered sustainable. In the 1980s, debt above 40% of GDP was seen as problematic for many countries. By the 2000s, 60% was the Maastricht benchmark. After the financial crisis, 90% became the focal point of debate. Today, some academic models suggest that optimal debt levels for advanced economies could be as high as 130%, depending on the interest rate environment and the productivity of public investment. Each upward revision is accompanied by sophisticated econometric analysis showing why the new level is justified. But taken together, the revisions suggest to us that the concept of a fixed threshold may be illusory. What actually exists is a constantly adjusting tolerance zone that reflects current political and economic conditions more than fundamental economic limits. The paper includes a comparative analysis of threshold estimates from different sources over time. In 2000, the median threshold cited in policy documents was around 60%. By 2010, it had risen to 90%. By 2020, studies were publishing estimates ranging from 70 to 130%, depending on the model and country sample. The variance widened as debt levels rose, suggesting that the search for a universal threshold had given way to arguments for country-specific or context-dependent limits. This shift makes the framework more flexible and arguably more realistic, but it also removes the clear warning signal that a fixed threshold would provide. If every country has its own threshold, and if that threshold can be revised based on changing assessments of institutional quality or economic conditions, then the concept loses much of its constraining power. The authors point out that this upward drift is not unique to debt thresholds. Similar patterns appear in other areas of economic policy. Inflation targets were once set at 0 or very low positive rates. Over time, 2% became the standard. Now there are discussions about raising targets to 3 or 4% to provide more policy space. Deficit limits under fiscal rules have been repeatedly adjusted or suspended. The pattern is one of initial strictness, followed by gradual loosening as political and economic pressures mount. The stated reason is always that circumstances have changed or that understanding has improved. The effect is to validate whatever policy is currently being pursued. In the case of debt thresholds, the effect has been to allow debt to rise without triggering the alarm that the original thresholds were designed to sound. Another section examines the heterogeneity of debt effects across countries. Some nations have sustained debt above 100% of GDP for decades without crises. Japan is the most prominent example, with debt above 200% and yet maintaining low borrowing costs and economic stability. Other countries face debt distress at much lower levels. The difference lies in factors such as currency sovereignty, the composition of the investor base, institutional credibility, and economic structure. Countries that borrow in their own currency and have captive domestic investors can sustain higher debt than countries that borrow in foreign currency from international markets. This heterogeneity is real and should inform debt sustainability analysis, but it also creates opportunities for motivated reasoning. A country that wants to justify high debt can point to Japan. A country that wants to impose austerity can point to Greece. The same data set supports multiple narratives. The paper also reviews the role of interest rates in determining sustainable debt levels. When interest rates are below the growth rate of the economy, debt dynamics are favorable. The government can run primary deficits and still see the debt ratio stabilize or fall. When interest rates exceed the growth rate, even primary surpluses may not be enough to stabilize debt. This relationship is mechanical and does not depend on thresholds. Yet the level of interest rates is itself influenced by monetary policy, inflation expectations, and global capital flows, all of which can shift rapidly. A debt level that appears sustainable when rates are at 2% can become unsustainable if rates rise to 5%. This sensitivity to interest rates means that thresholds based on current conditions may not hold in the future. The models that produce high optimal debt estimates typically assume low rates will persist. If that assumption is wrong, the debt becomes problematic regardless of the threshold. The final section of the paper turns to the political economy of threshold revision. It notes that thresholds are revised most frequently after major crises, when debt has already risen sharply. The revision is framed as a technical update, but it also serves to normalize the higher debt levels and reduce pressure for rapid consolidation. This pattern suggests that thresholds function more as ex post descriptions of what has already occurred than as ex ante constraints on policy. The paper quotes an internal memo from a fiscal policy unit that states, with unusual candor, that the purpose of debt sustainability analysis is not to prevent high debt, but to identify the conditions under which high debt can be managed. That distinction is subtle, but important. It shifts the focus from prevention to accommodation. The draft concludes without offering a definitive threshold. Instead, it argues that the search for a universal number is misguided. Debt sustainability depends on too many variables, many of which are country-specific and time-varying, to be captured in a single ratio. What matters is not the level of debt per se, but the trajectory, the composition, the vulnerability to shocks, and the political capacity to adjust when necessary. A country with 80% debt and strong institutions may be more sustainable than a country with 50% debt and weak institutions. A country with 120% debt and low interest rates may be safer than a country with 70% debt and high rates. The paper suggests that instead of focusing on thresholds, analysts should focus on stress tests, contingency planning, and transparency about risks. The final paragraph raises a question that the authors do not answer. If thresholds are continuously revised upward to match rising debt, and if sustainability analysis is designed to identify how high debt can be managed rather than to prevent it, then what function do these frameworks actually serve? Are they tools for maintaining discipline, or are they tools for legitimizing whatever debt path governments have chosen? The paper notes that this question cannot be answered from the data alone. It requires a judgment about intent and institutional behavior, and it leaves the reader with a stark observation. The countries that have crossed every threshold and violated every rule are still borrowing, still rated as safe, and still treated as models of fiscal management, while countries that stayed within the guidelines often face higher spreads and greater scrutiny. That asymmetry suggests that thresholds, whatever their technical merit, are applied selectively and interpreted through the lens of power and market position as much as through the lens of economics.